Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's going on in Cuba. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that we've been closely following the events in Cuba, where there is an ongoing food, gasoline and medicine crisis caused by a combination of the long-standing sanctions applied against Cuba by the USA, as well as the historic failure of the close relationship with the Soviet Union, which fell apart in the 1990s, and then the subsequent problems with the relationship with Venezuela from 2017 onwards when sanctions were applied by the West against Venezuela. Cuba is an island and a net importer and suffers from the same fate as a lot of the other countries that we've talked about on the channel, whereby it has to buy in large quantities of oil and food and therefore requires large foreign currency reserves. But unfortunately, from Cuba's point of view, they run a negative balance of trade and have run out of foreign currency. And in order to get itself out of this situation, Cuba has been reaching out to other friendly nations that also have a socialist culture, such as Russia, China and Iran. And of course, one of the major issues here is Cuba's close proximity to the USA. It's located around 100 miles south of Miami. So in today's video, I'll have a look at reports that China has now agreed to set up military facilities on Cuba, which is causing concern from the US perspective. I'll provide you with an update on the reported agreement for China to set up a spy station on Cuba so that it can listen to US transmissions and telecommunications. I'll give you an update on Cuba's relations with Iran, China and Russia. We'll have a look at what's going on with inflation, interest rates and the currency. We'll talk about the recent flooding that's affected large parts of the island and the forthcoming hurricane season. We'll have a look at the ongoing food crisis, and then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think is likely to happen for Cuba over the course of the next 3 to 6 months. Cuba is the largest of all of the Caribbean islands and has a population of around 11 million people. Cuba is located around 100 miles from the south tip of Florida and is so close that the old joke goes, what's the capital of Cuba? Miami. Up until the late 1950s, the USA and Cuba actually had a very strong trading relationship. However, in 1959, Fidel Castro took over as the ruler of the country and introduced common ownership policies and took over ownership of a lot of assets that were owned by the American government and also closely aligned itself with Russia and the Soviet Union. As a result of this, the USA placed an embargo on Cuba and heavy sanctions have been in place against Cuba since 1962. Now, throughout the 60s, 70s and early 80s, the relationship between Russia and Cuba was very strong, and Russia actually provided a lot of financial support and sent large quantities of oil to Cuba, and Cuba built up its power station network using that oil. In the late 80s, as the Soviet Union started to fall apart, the support to Cuba fell, and this put major economic pressure on the Cuban authorities, which led to a debt default in 1986. Now, following the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1990, Cuba was thrown into economic crisis and was thrown a lifeline subsequently by Venezuela, which was also operating a communist policy. But unfortunately, Venezuela went into its own economic crisis in 2016, and this led to a major fall in the amount of oil that Venezuela was providing to Cuba, and as a result, Cuba has been in an economic crisis ever since.
China is in talks to build a joint military facility in Cuba. This is according to the Wall Street Journal. China and Cuba are negotiating to establish a new joint military training facility on the island, now sparking an alarm in the United States of America over the prospects of stationing Chinese troops and other security operations, that too just 100 miles off Florida's coast. According to the reports, the discussions for the facility are at an advanced stage but have not concluded yet. Reports also reveal that Joe Biden's administration contacted the Cuban officials in trying to stop the deal. Washington said last month that it had made its concerns known to Cuba about hosting Chinese spy operations. According to the sources, the proposed Cuban base is a part of China's Project 141, which is a plan to build a global network of military bases and logistical support. White House earlier said that Beijing has had intelligence relations with Havana for quite some time and has also accused Beijing of running electronic spy bases in Cuba. Now, the latest reports of a Chinese training facility in Cuba comes after U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's 2-day diplomatic visit to Beijing, where he met with the Chinese President Xi Jinping.
This is something we're going to be monitoring very, very closely.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that he voiced concerns to his counterparts in China during a rare trip to Beijing about China's military activities in Cuba.
Made very clear that we would have deep concerns about PRC intelligence or military activities in Cuba. And we will protect our homeland. We will protect our interests.
The Wall Street Journal reported on Tuesday that China and Cuba are negotiating to establish a joint military training facility on the island that could lead to the stationing of Chinese troops just 100 miles off Florida's coast. Speaking at a press conference in London after his trip to Beijing, Blinken said he pressed for opening military communication channels with China.
President Biden sent me to Beijing because he believes strongly that both the United States and China have an obligation to manage our relationship responsibly. And that starts with strengthening lines of communication.
During Blinken's visit to Beijing earlier this week, the first by a U.S. Secretary of State since 2018, the nations agreed to temper rivalries to avoid conflict. But there were no breakthroughs.
I think both countries see the importance of trying to bring more stability to the relationship.
A lack of open channels between both nations has prompted international jitters, with Beijing's reluctance to engage in regular military-to-military talks with Washington alarming China's neighbors. In Beijing, the two sides appeared entrenched over a multitude of issues, from Taiwan to trade, including U.S. actions toward China's chip industry, plus human rights, and Russia's war against Ukraine, to which China maintains an impartial response.
President Biden said from the outset of Russia's aggression against Ukraine that we would stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes.
Birds chirp and lush trees sway in the wind, a scene of Caribbean tranquility. But just outside the sleepy Cuban village, called Bejucal, is what the U.S. government suspects has long been an intelligence gathering facility that once hid Soviet nuclear warheads. Now, large parabolic antennas are partially obscured by vegetation, and a sign nearby warns, "Keep out, military zone." The United States believes the base, just 116 miles from Florida's Key West, is used to intercept U.S. electronic communications, according to a Federal Communications Commission document from November 2022. And it's newly in focus after the Wall Street Journal, citing unnamed American officials, reported Washington was worried that China was working towards setting up a spy base in Cuba to better eavesdrop on the U.S. China denied the Journal reports. A foreign ministry spokesperson called the allegations a farce. The Biden administration has shared few details. Here's Secretary of State Antony Blinken.
With regard to Cuba, when this administration took office in January 2021, we were briefed on a number of sensitive efforts by Beijing around the world to expand their overseas logistics, basing, collection infrastructure to allow them to project and sustain military power at a greater distance. Based on the information we have, the PRC conducted an upgrade of its intelligence collection facilities in Cuba in 2019.
The communist-run government said Blinken's assertions about a Chinese spy base in Cuba are false. And it has dismissed prior allegations as a U.S. fabrication meant to justify Washington's decades-old economic embargo against the island. During the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, Bejucal gained notoriety after U.S. spy planes uncovered it as a hiding place for Soviet nuclear warheads. Moscow backed down and removed the missiles, but it is widely regarded as the moment when the U.S. and Soviet Union came closest to nuclear confrontation. But now, the small communist-ruled island could once again be central in great power rivalries.
The Iranian president with his Cuban counterpart both met and are scheduled to bolster ties. From biotechnology to telecommunications, almost nothing is off the table. This visit is in a series of initiatives taken up by Cuba. Havana is making deliberate attempts to reach out to distant but critical allies. Before this, they were with Russia and China. two countries that have emerged as a direct threat to the United States, either geopolitically or in trade. Russia and China are hitting U.S. exactly where it hurts and wooing Cuba exactly where it will cave. Moscow and Beijing have signed deals to ease Cuba's debt burden. The communist-run country has been living under a U.S. trade embargo. These restrictions were reinforced by former U.S. President Donald Trump. The curbs have contributed to an unprecedented economic crisis, because of which Cuba has seen shortages of food, fuel, and medicine.
Которых живет Куба, продолжаются десятилетиями. Тем не менее, кубинский народ справляется с этим. Мы со своей стороны будем делать все для того, чтобы наше экономическое взаимодействие помогало преодолевать эти привнесенные извне сложности.
Just last week, the Wall Street Journal reported that China has reached a secret agreement with Cuba to build an electronic eavesdropping facility on the island nation. As we said, it is very close to the U.S. coast. So that location would let Chinese spies scoop up electronic communication in the southeast of the United States. This is a region home to a sizable portion of the nation's domestic military bases. White House officials disputed the accuracy of the report. Whether true or not, the United States needs to keep its backyard in check. The threat will not always be in the form of a huge spy balloon. Sometimes it could be a Cuban Trojan horse.
Now, ordinarily, when we're doing a deep dive on any country, we will go through a lot of the economic data to establish exactly what's happening in the economy. But the problem that we have when we're talking about Cuba is that the data is very limited. We don't get comprehensive statistics published on a monthly basis. But one of the things that Cuba does publish is its rate of inflation. And this chart shows the movement in the rate of inflation over the course of the last 12 months. And what this shows is that in June 2022, inflation was running at just under 29%, so incredibly high. However, over the course of the last 12 months, we have seen almost a consistent increase month on month in inflation. And the latest available figures show that inflation is now running at over 45%, which means that year on year prices are almost 50% higher than they were this time last year. However, the situation in Cuba is actually much worse than this, because these are the official statistics. And if you look at the reports on social media, it's claimed that the movement in prices is significantly more than 50%. So if you follow the channel, you'll know that a lot of countries have experienced high levels of inflation over the course of the last 2 years. And the traditional way of dealing with high inflation is to increase interest rates. So let's have a look at what's been going on with interest rates in Cuba. This chart shows the movement in interest rates in Cuba over the last 12 months. And as you can see, this is an entirely flat line, and interest rates have remained at 2.25% over the course of the last year. And actually, if we expand this graph out to show the situation over the last 25 years, you can see that the official rate of interest has been sitting at 2.25% for the whole time. So obviously that means there's been no attempts by the Cuban central bank to raise interest rates in order to try to bring down high levels of inflation. And the reason that the Cuban central bank haven't made any moves to increase interest rates is that they're not following the traditional capitalist model. They're operating a communist model. So the people of Cuba aren't taking mortgages to buy property, they're not taking loans to buy cars. The system that Cuba is operating is entirely different. But we've still got a major problem with inflation that needs to be addressed. But the problem from Cuba's perspective is that the reason that they're seeing such rapid increases in prices is that they're having to import the vast majority of goods that they're using. And as I'm sure you'll be aware, over the course of the last 18 months, we've seen prices rising. However, in the last 6 months, we have started to see prices coming back down, but not in Cuba. And one of the reasons for that is that Cuba is not a great counterparty to deal with. They don't have any cash, and therefore they're struggling to buy things in the open market and to be able to pay for all of their imports. Now, one of the common themes that we see where we have an economy that's in trouble and we have high levels of inflation is that we usually see a devaluation of the currency. As inflation starts to increase, that means that the value of the home currency is decreasing rapidly. And in these situations, the local population often abandon their home currency and start using things like the US dollar instead, which they have more confidence in. And in addition to that, countries that are struggling are often net importers, so there's no real demand for their currency. If they were exporting lots of goods, then other countries may need to buy their currency to pay for them, but if you're a net importer, nobody needs to do that. And in addition to that, countries that are struggling often fail to attract overseas investment, so they're not getting large quantities of foreign currency coming into the country. So for all of those reasons, we often see the currency starting to weaken. And this chart shows us the official movement of the US dollar against the Cuban peso over the course of the last 12 months. And once again, you can see that this is a flat line. The official exchange rate has been fixed at $1 US to 24 Cuban pesos for the last 12 months. And if we expand the chart out to show the position over the last 10 years, you can see that there's only been one movement in the official exchange rate, which took place at the end of December 2020. So this obviously doesn't make any sense given everything that we've just discussed about what's going on in Cuba's economy. And the reason that this chart doesn't make any sense is that the Cuban peso is not a floating currency. The exchange rate is not being set by demand and supply in the markets, it's fixed by the Cuban authorities. However, in reality, nobody is doing business on the basis of an exchange rate of 24 to 1. And in terms of cash money exchange, the Cuban authorities themselves are actually working on a completely different rate. This chart shows the official cash exchange rates being offered in Cuba. And you can see that if you're looking to exchange US dollars, the official sell rate is 110 pesos to $1, and the official buy rate is $123. However, if you're looking to exchange US dollars in Cuba, you would not use the official exchange rate. You would use the black market rate. And this chart shows that the latest black market rate is 198 Cuban pesos to $1 US, which is more than 8 times higher than the official rate. And when you have a situation like this where there are 3 different exchange rates for the currency, what tends to happen is there is a high level of dollarization. And dollarization is the situation where the local population decide that they no longer want to use the local currency and that they would prefer to use US dollars. And that's what's happening in Cuba for a lot of the cash transactions.
Raging water sweeping through homes, leaving communities underwater, thousands evacuated, and at least 1 person killed. The military using helicopters in some areas to rescue families, including women and children. They warned us before, but we didn't want to leave, and now we had to get out, said this man after he boarded one of the military helicopters. Others, like this elderly couple, rescued on boats from their homes. Cuba's central and eastern areas are the most affected after a weekend of heavy rain causing rivers to overflow. Over 400 rural communities affected by the flooding. We're trying to save everything we can while helping neighbors, said this man. Official media reporting some 10,000 homes have been damaged and more than 7,000 people have been evacuated. Days of rain have left the ground saturated with water, with dams at capacity, and the forecast indicating more rain may come in a country where the needs are overwhelming.
Lack of food, lack of medicine, lack of gasoline, which affects aid to any part of the country right now.
The flooding already damaging over 2,000 acres of crops, including fruits and vegetables, vital to help with those food shortages.
Add a disaster such as flooding or hurricanes, and it becomes almost unbearable for the Cuban people right now.
Many bracing for another tough year with a new hurricane season just beginning.
Cuba's economy minister, Alejandro Gil, recently stated that there is no quick fix for Cuba's sputtering economy, as inflation, fuel shortages, plunging farm production and a cash crunch drag on output and continue to fan discontent in the communist-run nation. He went on to say that there was too little foreign currency on the island to pay for fuel, food and farm imports, meaning Cuba will increasingly need to scrape by on what it can produce at home. If we can't produce it, we won't have it, he told lawmakers, referring specifically to some food products and urging legislators and municipalities to put renewed impetus on farm output this year and next. Tourism, once a key driver of much-needed foreign exchange, has struggled to revive, with visitor numbers between January and April 2023 only half of the same period from 2019. And this has left the country short of the foreign currency necessary to import critical farming necessities like fertiliser and animal feed. As an example, the production of pork for the state plunged from a record 199 tonnes in 2017 to just 16 tonnes in 2022. And it's reported that many fruits and vegetables have fared equally poorly. Fuel that might otherwise help bolster farm production and deliver goods to market has been rerouted to electricity generation. And Cuba used nearly twice as much diesel as planned to produce electricity in the first 4 months of 2023. The economy minister went on to say that soaring food prices due to inefficiencies and dwindling production have far outpaced the buying power of most Cubans, leaving many with salaries short of covering their basic needs.
Cuba's rock-bottom economy and its inability to provide for the island's 11 million residents continues to promote strife. A hefty portion of food comes from the United States. The headline, Cuban government-controlled food purchases and imported from the U.S. are down 21%.
They're not importing as much overall because they don't have money.
In 2021, U.S. to Cuba commodity exports, such as chicken, $28.5 million worth. By 2022, down to $26 million, and in the 12-month period ending March of 2023, almost $20.5 million. Cuba used to be a major producer of coffee. Now they have to import from the U.S.
One, incredible mismanagement. Two, state involvement, which makes it incredibly inefficient. Three, weather. The areas where the plantations are have just gotten pummeled every year.
So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video really to provide you with an update as to what's happening in Cuba. And as we've seen from today's data, the economic crisis is continuing. Inflation is running above 45%. The Cuban peso continues to deteriorate on the black market, which is forcing the majority of the population to use US dollars. And Cuba continues to experience shortages of food, fuel and medicine, and we've got blackouts occurring on a regular basis. And as we go through into the summer period, when Cuba gets very hot and therefore there's a high demand for air conditioning, blackouts therefore equate to sweltering conditions. So the economy of Cuba is currently in tatters. Now, when we talk about most countries in this situation, the saving grace is an IMF bailout. The IMF is there to try to help countries that are on the brink of bankruptcy, to give them an injection of cash, to make sure that they can continue to buy things like food and fuel. But unfortunately, from Cuba's point of view, when Fidel Castro took over the country, he burned his bridges with the IMF, and so that is no longer an option. So Cuba needs to find friendly nations to try to get it out of this dire situation. And it's reaching out to other left-wing countries, to other countries that have socialist ideology, or alternatively countries that do not want to deal with the West. And as we've seen in today's video, it's now trying to strengthen its relations with China, Russia and Iran, all of whom can provide it with vital resources. And clearly on the flip side of that relationship, all three of those countries are looking to develop further trading relations with non-Western countries, particularly Russia and Iran, who themselves are both subject to a variety of sanctions by the USA and the West. So essentially what we're seeing forming here is a new East-West divide. If we look back in history, in the 60s, 70s and 80s, we had a Cold War. There was an East-West divide, predominantly between the USA and the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union was broken up in 1991, and that really led to a thawing of the Cold War. We didn't have that strong East-West divide, and Russia became more commercialized, it became more capitalist, and started doing trade with a lot of countries in the West. However, things have changed materially since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The extensive sanctions that have been applied against Russia has meant that Russia is now seeking out other countries who are no longer dealing with the West. And Cuba represents an ideal trading partner and is also a sore point from the USA's point of view, firstly because of its proximity and secondly because of its history. We had the Cuban Missile Crisis back in the early 60s when Russia was looking to put nuclear weapons onto the island and the USA gave it an ultimatum and we came very close to having a nuclear war. And I think the absolutely fascinating thing about the current situation is how things are going to develop over the course of the next 3 to 6 to 12 months. Russia clearly wants to get closer to Cuba, as does China, as does Iran. And Cuba is very receptive to those approaches because it's desperate for cash and fuel and food. And realistically, the only way that the USA could avoid the strengthening of these relations would be if it wanted to step in and provide all of those resources directly to Cuba itself. However, that looks fairly unlikely right now. So over the course of the next 6 to 12 months, it is very likely that we will see Cuba getting closer to these countries, and the East-West divide is likely to strengthen. So the overall summary of today's video is that Cuba remains in a perilous, dire situation. The economy is basically bust. It's bankrupt. It doesn't have enough money to be able to keep buying in what it needs. So it needs aid. It needs assistance. And that financial assistance looks like it's coming from Russia, China, and Iran. And that is going to upset the USA. And I am sure political tensions will rise further over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. So I'll keep you posted on any further news and developments as and when they happen. Hopefully you found today's episode useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. And here's something to put a smile on your face.